Sorry, everyone. We're just trying to resolve it. Yeah.
No worries. Thanks, Zoe.
We're just sending out the new link now, so give us a few minutes and hopefully the attendees will start going up.
Good morning, everybody. Apologise for the technical issues that we're experiencing at the moment. This is all new to us, but you're in the right place if you're intending to attend the Welwyn Hatfield, St Albans and Hertsmere online domestic abuse conference. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes because we know that we haven't got everybody joining us. So if you're just happy to just stand by for a moment, and then we'll start the meeting properly in a few moments. Thank you. Okay, good morning. Welcome to those that have found their way to our online domestic abuse conference for 2020. If I introduce myself, my name is Valerie Kane. I'm Community Safety Manager at Hertsmere Borough Council, and I also chair the St Albans and Hertsmere Domestic Abuse Forum. Thank you for joining us. We have got attendees from many different organisations, and as usual, that's how we've always run them every year, welcoming people from all across our varying districts. So this is our first attempt at doing a virtual conference, and apologies for those technical difficulties in the beginning. First of all, I just want to thank Zoe and her team for putting this together. Very brave step, in my opinion. Hopefully you are all able to hear me and take part in as much as listening to the wealth of experience coming from our speakers. So yeah, just please bear with us. As I've said, this is our first attempt, and we'll do our best to ensure that any further technical issues are resolved as soon as possible. There'll be two presentations first off, then we'll have a short comfort break at 11. During that comfort break, there will be a clip being played detailing a story which links to the final presentation of the day from Alex. You have the choice whether you want to watch that. It's quite a moving clip, so you make your mind up, please, in time for that. And after the comfort break, we'll have further presentations, followed by a Q&A session. So what I would like you to do, feel free to ask the panel any questions you like, and what I suggest you do is put that in the Q&A box and I will pick that up at the end and sort through and ask questions on your behalf, if that's okay. What else was I going to say? Just enjoy. If there are any issues, just let us know, and we'll see what we can do. So welcome. We're kicking off. Our first speaker is Leonie Madden from Hearts Young Homeless. She's going to be talking about young person on parent violence. Just a quick overview of Leonie. She works at Hearts Young Homeless, as I've said, and has had various roles, including crisis intervention, prevention, education and youth support work, and was recently involved in the creation and the launch of the domestic abuse prevention project, Your Voice, Your Choice. Leonie, over to you.
Thank you, Valerie. Good morning, everybody. I hope this works. I'm going to share my screen now for the presentation, and I'm just going to change the view so it's nice and big. I hope that's worked so that everybody can see. So yes, good morning. I am Leonie, and I've come to speak to you this morning from Hearts Young Homeless. Why are we talking about adolescent parent violence and abuse? I think that it's a really good subject to talk about, especially considering the subject of this conference, because it's one of the forms of domestic abuse that don't get talked about as often. And it's certainly not always the first thing that you think of when you think of domestic abuse. So, but we know that as a trend, we're seeing it happen more and more often amongst our service users. So we thought it'd be really interesting to share this information, to share a little bit about what we do in these situations and some advice about practice around this if you ever experience this in your professional roles, or even in personal bits and bobs that you might be doing if a friend experiences it or anything like that, in the hopes that it can be really helpful. So to start off, what is it? What am I talking about when I say adolescent parent violence? It's just any behaviour by a young person to control or dominate their parents. So when we talk about adolescent parent violence and abuse, we're not talking about a young person that's got anger issues. That comes up quite a lot, certainly when we get referrals to our services where this type of thing is going on. People often identify that young person as having anger management issues or things like that. That's actually, it's not the same thing. When we think of domestic abuse, abusive behaviour is about power and control, whereas anger management issues are about identifying emotions and learning how to express those emotions. So we're going to talk about some case studies about how you can identify the difference between a young person who is abusing their parents and a young person who actually needs help with anger management and those types of things, because they're two separate things and need dealing with quite differently. So that's what it is, and that's what we're talking about. What do we see when we have a young person who is displaying these types of behaviours? Well, it will be where a young person uses various tactics, and you'll see nice and big in the middle there the phrase "get in their way," and I'm going to explain that a little bit more because it sounds a bit hard-hitting, but I'll get there. So obviously threats, what we see when a young person is threatening their parents, they're not always threatening violence, although they do sometimes do that. Most common threats that we actually hear are that they'll tell somebody at school or another adult that the parent's hurting them or doing something to them in order to have control of that situation and get their way. So those are the kind of threats that we see most often being used by young people to try and control a situation. We see sometimes passive aggression, and what I mean by that is using silence or not speaking, or complete non-compliance with the parent until they get their way. There can sometimes be verbal aggression, and what we see when we see conflict within families is that the young person will escalate with verbal aggression. When they're in conflict, they'll escalate arguments really quickly, so they get really big really fast, saying horrible, hurtful or threatening things to their family. Damage to property, so that's, you know, breaking things, punching walls, doors, causing damage. If there's younger siblings in the home while this type of thing is going on, this is obviously quite dangerous and frightening for the younger siblings as well. So damage to property can cause quite a lot of escalation and problems within the family home. Financial abuse, when we talk about domestic abuse, we are getting better at having an understanding of that financial control and that financial abuse. And young people do this as well. They will demand money from the parent, even if that actually has a negative impact on that parent being able to pay bills or buy food, and in order to get that money. And then you've got obviously physical aggression, physical violence, hitting, spitting, throwing things at the parent. So these are the types of behaviours that we see. And as I say, when you are working with a young person and they are displaying these behaviours, and you try and get to the root cause, why are you doing that? Why did you throw that? Why did you punch that door? If at the root of that is that actually, well, because they didn't do what I said and it's about getting their way, then we know that this is an abusive behaviour and that this is actually young person on parent domestic abuse, because it will be about having control of that situation. So when we're talking about this, I know I said at the beginning it's something that we're kind of seeing on the rise as a trend. So I wanted to touch briefly just on how common it actually is, so we can see what the issue is. So unfortunately, we haven't got the latest stats on this. They're not actually being released until early next year. So the stats are a little bit old. There's some more recent ones from the Safeguarding Children's Board, but last we looked at it, reports to police of child to parent violence have actually increased by 95% across the UK. So this is something that is definitely, reports of this are increasing. In 2016, 1,459 young people were actually charged with an offence related to domestic violence against their parent. At Hearts Young Homeless, our mediation team, of the cases that are actually referred to them for family conflict, family breakdown, there's domestic violence within 35% of those cases. Some of this being child on parent violence rather than parents being domestically violent and the young person witnessing that and being a victim of that. And it is certainly a trend that our mediation team are seeing more and more often and having to use various tools in order to help that family, because these behaviours are becoming more and more common. And the Safeguarding Children's Board did recent research, and it does actually suggest that it is more common than we think, with approximately 20% of teens being violent to their parents, 10% actually seriously so. So when we're looking at this being on the increase and becoming more of an issue, it's really important for us to kind of ask that question, why? Why is this happening? Why are young people using domestic abuse to try and control their parents? And there can be lots of various reasons. I've put up just some examples here when working with families of underlying causes, you know, as a reaction to something that they're going through. One of our case studies, you'll see it will be it's because of a reaction to something that they're going through and something that was happening with peers. Sometimes it's because they're being bullied outside the home, and so they're trying to maintain control in an environment where they feel they can control it. There can occasionally be undiagnosed mental health issues or emotional issues going on there. It could be that there's family breakdown going on between parents, and that's having that impact on that young person's trying to regain control of a situation. So there can be explanations for why this is going on within a family setting, but sometimes actually we work with that young person and there isn't some underlying cause and there isn't an explanation other than that this is the behaviour that they have learned they can use to get their way. And sometimes it can really be that simple. They've learned that if I do this behaviour, this is how I get my needs met, and this is how that happens. And we could really go down the rabbit hole on this. You know, could this be, if it's on the increase now, could this be a deeper societal issue? I know that with some of the parents that we work with and talk to, you know, some often say, you know, oh, we don't have control over our kids the way that we used to. We can't exercise our authority over our children the way that we used to. That's a common theme that comes up when working with parents. You know, which some people can struggle with. And, you know, society has changed. We talk to parents who feel a lot of guilt because parents don't feel like they can be around as much because they have to work more because the cost of living is so high. So parents are experiencing guilt and looking for reasons to blame themselves as to why their child might be displaying these really abusive behaviours. You know, and we could look at those environmental factors as well that have changed so rapidly over the last 10 years. Constant access to mobile phones and social media, computer games, free access to pornography, which we know is having impacts in other areas of domestic abuse that we look at as well. Mainstream content just generally becoming more violent and more explicit, you know, but as I say, that's a real rabbit hole and I don't have the answers, but those are all things when we're looking at why this is happening. I know that there could just be so many, and I'd be really interested in the Q&A when you're putting your questions. If you have any thoughts, feel free to share them, because it would be really, really great to hear. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just checking the time because I know we started a little bit late. Okay, we're doing well. I'm going to share some case studies from our mediation service that have worked with families where the young people are being domestically abusive to their parents. And I felt this was really, really good to share because it kind of gives you those thoughts and those feelings of what these families are actually going through when this type of thing is going on. So the first case study that I'm going to share is of a mother and son, and they were referred to our mediation service. And on the referral, the reason was the young man had been identified as having anger management issues. So when mediation started working with this family, it became really clear that the son would use physical violence against his mum, punching, pushing, spitting, throwing objects at her. He would use verbal insults, especially about her appearance, to really bother her and upset her. He would be very controlling, and if he didn't feel like he was in control, he would use threats. For example, he would tell the teachers at school that his mum had been hurting him, beating him up, in order to maintain control of those situations. And mum was really good at identifying that actually it really only escalated to that physical abuse when he didn't get his own way, or whenever he was challenged about his behaviour. And when they went out together in public, he would behave in a way that would be purposefully embarrassing to mum, to attract attention from others, especially if she had done something that he didn't like. He would use that behaviour to punish her almost. So it was really breaking down, and it was a shame because mum was sharing thoughts and feelings during these sessions. I put some quotes up there, you know, I'm being mentally abused by my own son. I know he wouldn't care if I died. I just can't do this anymore. I can't be a parent anymore. So mum had really reached breaking point in this situation, but she was also afraid to fully exert parental authority, because that's when it escalated to those physical aggressive techniques where he would punch, push and spit at his mum, and that obviously created fear in that situation, and she really struggled with that. So when our mediation team worked with this mother and son, what they did was they really broke it down back to basics, and started exploring what their emotional needs were, and tried to get them to identify what it is that they actually need from the other person in the relationship. And they actually both identified the same thing. They both just wanted to be loved by the other person, to be respected and to be appreciated. And those they both felt were their most important emotional needs. So our mediation team explored this with them about what it is that they needed to see from the other person in order to feel this and get these needs met, hoping that if those emotional needs were being met, it would de-escalate the situation. And by de-escalating that situation, the son in this situation was able to recognise how he was escalating these situations really quickly and using these tactics, and started to really feel like using physical violence when he wasn't getting his way wasn't going to be the way that either of them were going to be happy, and he started to recognise this behaviour. Another thing that mediation does, and they did with this mother and son, is they got them to answer a questionnaire that identify your argument styles, and I would really recommend this. You can just go online, and if you Google argument styles, it will bring up quizzes, and you can identify as 5 different argument styles. There's the shark, the fox, the owl, the turtle, and one other, it's gone out of my head, but it teaches you how different argument styles really clash and escalate situations just because of how you've learned to argue. So we use that as a tool to kind of break down where things are going wrong within their communication, and this was a really useful tool in this situation. And another thing that's really helpful to do is to start getting the person to identify what their red flags are. Again, it's really interesting to do this with yourself, and I'd recommend it. We all have red flags, those things that really annoy us, that can escalate a situation really quickly. So, for example, I know that I identify one of my red flags is people rolling their eyes. It really just, so by getting people to understand what their red flags are and what's escalating the situation really quickly, this can really help. Now, obviously, this is just some examples, and mediation works with a family for a really long time, and I've really shortened it down and simplified it. But the outcome for this mother and son with mediation was really good, and there was a real reduction whilst they were in mediation about the physical and verbal violence and about understanding each other's needs. Another case study that I have is of a mother, father, daughter, and I referred to this one a little bit earlier. So the reason for the referral was anger management and young person not following boundaries. I bring these up again because when we're getting these referrals, it's often identified as an anger management issue. And when I was talking at the beginning, obviously it's not the same thing and can be treated as a really separate thing. But actually, if there's domestic violence and domestic abuse, then it needs to be treated quite differently. Now, this escalated and got referred to us by police. The parents hadn't actually received any intervention up to this point until it escalated to the point where quite a serious incident happened, where the daughter got physical in a car, and there was nearly a car accident because she wasn't getting her way, and the parents actually thought, actually, whilst they'd been protecting their daughter because they didn't want her to get into trouble, this had actually gone too far, and they didn't feel in control of the situation. So things had already escalated really far by this point, but the daughter would use punching, biting, spitting, especially spitting, and throwing objects at her parents when she wasn't getting her way. The parents really felt she becomes violent when we say no to her. She does not like not getting her own way, and they were scared for her future because she was being very physical. The police had started to get involved. They were worried about her having a criminal record. They had all of these worries and fears going on. Another quote, I felt sad that I can't control my own child being violent towards me, and they were constantly walking on eggshells around her. Now, when mediation got involved and they unpicked this a little bit, there was a little bit of an underlying issue in that the daughter just wanted to go out more, but the parents had identified that she'd started hanging around with a local gang, and they were really worried about her about these behaviours, and they were trying to protect her from these things, but that was really causing conflict because that wasn't what she wanted. It had actually broken down to the point where mediation couldn't do the whole family together, and they had to meet with the daughter and the mother and the father separately at first before they could bring them together. But they used really similar tools to the previous case study about exploring what their needs are. What needs do they have that aren't being met? What are their emotional needs? And really getting them to explore a little bit more and take a step back about what it is that's missing and why we're all feeling that need to control the situation. And they did exercises around argument styles and red flags as well. And they were eventually able to bring them all together in order to de-escalate the situation and teach them new ways to get through conflict and to compromise with each other so that all needs were being met. So again, this was another situation where there was domestic abuse present, and our mediation team were able to de-escalate it enough to unpick it so that everybody felt like they had a portion of the control in the situation so that they could express how they were feeling and move forward. Now, those are just some really brief examples, and as I say, mediation, there's so much. You could talk about these case studies all day because they work with them for quite a long time and there really is a lot to unpick, so I don't want to simplify it too much, but it's really important to kind of discuss what it is that we can do to help. So there are actually barriers, and I've touched on them a little bit, excuse me. Sorry. There are barriers to people accessing help, and families, they can often feel ashamed that they're failing as a parent, and that's something that we hear a lot from parents who are going through these types of really tough experiences with their children. And as I was saying earlier, we really need to try and change that narrative around it, because as we talked earlier, there's quite a lot of outside influences that can actually be affecting that young person and causing that behaviour. So we need to reassure parents that this isn't a failure and this isn't something to be ashamed of. They can also be scared to get help. They fear the consequences for them as a parent, but also for their child. There's the added complication that this is their child, and so it is their instinct to protect them. And if they think their child's going to get in trouble, that can actually be a real barrier, even when things are really difficult. So when it comes to domestic abuse, that is a real complication. We've talked before about when there's domestic abuse present in intimate relationships, that love that a survivor can have for their abuser can complicate things. So imagine how complex it can be for a parent whose child is the one that is actually being abusive. It really is a barrier to them actually talking to somebody and getting the help that they need. Some parents think that it might just be a bit of a phase, so we'll just carry on and they'll grow out of it, they'll get past it, so they might not get the intervention when it's needed. And certainly for separated parents, it can complicate implementing parental techniques that they might use in order to try and de-escalate the situation and address that young person's behaviour if there isn't that co-parenting going on, or they might be undermining each other. Sometimes that can happen with separated parents as well. So we need to be aware of that as professionals when working with these families, that we might need to support them with any kind of shame or fear that they might be feeling for their child about getting that help. So you as a professional, if you're coming across things like this, please remain curious, try and establish what's happening. We talked about all the different types of behaviours that you might see. Is it physical? Are they using threats? Are they financially abusing their parent? You know, what is actually happening here? Try and establish that. If there is a why, because remember I said there sometimes isn't always a why, it's just happening as a form of control. If there is a why, try and find out a little bit about what that why is, because that can be really helpful, because then we can help support with the underlying cause as well as addressing the behaviour. and see if there is anything that this is communicating. So by unpicking it a little bit, we can establish whether, well, actually, no, it's just because when I do this, I get my way, or whether actually, are there anger management issues there? Are they having trouble actually processing their emotions? Because then that requires a different type of help. So just unpicking it and remaining curious really helps in these situations. You can use tools like I've discussed in the case study, so prompting that young person to share their thoughts and feelings. Again, why is this happening? You can identify eruption points and red flags. That's a really useful conversation to have with anybody. Like, what is it that really gets you reacting in this situation? Try and identify strategies of what we can do with feelings, just really simple ones, and all of those triggers. Now, these are interim tools to de-escalate when working with families and young people. It's always important to refer for longer term support. These are what I would call very much interim tools. These aren't going to get to the root cause of the problem, because this actually requires longer term, more intense intervention. But these are definitely things that we can all be doing when we're working with people who might be experiencing these type of difficulties. So HYH mediation service works with families in conflict. We prevent family breakdown and homelessness through short-term work based on communication and what's causing conflict, and this does include families where domestic abuse may be present. So that's really important to consider, you know, and remember, domestic abuse is child abuse, so it is a complication when the perpetrator is the child. But if there are siblings in the household, it's still a safeguarding issue. It can still cause serious problems for others in the family home. So always seek further advice. Give us a call if you need to. That's not a problem. We can talk through things if you're concerned about a family. And if our service isn't appropriate for that family, for whatever reason, we will always refer on and signpost on. And we've got a really good knowledge of what's out there so that we can still help these families. So that's it. I'm sorry to rush through it. I just was conscious of a bit of a late start, so I hope that's okay. Thank you so much for having me and for listening. You can visit our website. There's so much information on our website. It's really comprehensive, and all of our contact details to give us a call are on our website. So please, if you need anything, do contact us. Thank you very much. Right, let me stop sharing with you.
Thank you so much for that, Leonie. That was really, really informative. I've picked up quite a few tips. I'll be looking at my argument style myself. So thank you for that. Can I just remind people that have probably joined us late due to some of our technical issues that at 11 we're going to have a comfort break. During that break, there will be a short clip of about 8 minutes detailing a person giving their story, and that story will be referred to in the last session at 11:45. But it's up to you whether you want to take note of that clip or do something else, but the choice is yours. And also, can I ask you all just to keep your questions coming in as each speaker is doing their presentation? You may think of something that you want to ask. Please pop it into the question and answer session. I'll be very grateful. Leonie, thank you for helping us catch up on time. Really, really appreciate that. Okay, moving on. So we go now to Rachel Nicholson from Hourglass. She'll be presenting on older people and coercive control. So just a brief info about Rachel. She's Director of Performance and has a UK-wide role, ensuring the work of Hourglass is fulfilling its mission and achieving impact. She's also responsible for the work of Hourglass in Wales and the southwest of England. This involves the overall management of campaigning and media work, projects, conference organisation, and training and events. Rachel's remit also includes influencing policy and practice, raising awareness about and challenging the abuse of vulnerable older adults at every level, and campaigning to improve safeguards for all adults. Rachel is a qualified probation officer who works predominantly with domestic abuse perpetrators. She's also worked for Cardiff Children's Services Intake and Assessment Team and in the third sector in youth work, mental health and equality. A very round, amazing biography. So Rachel, over to you, all yours.
Thanks, Valerie. I'm just trying to share my screen now. There we go. Can everybody see that? Because oh, there we go. Lovely. Good morning, everybody. And yes, thanks, Valerie. And I'd forgotten there was such a large bio there. As Valerie said, I'm Director of Performance and Partnerships at Hourglass, working across the UK. Some of you may know as Action on Elder Abuse. We actually rebranded in March, but we've been working for over 30 years, focusing exclusively on the abuse of older people. So as I said, we rebranded in March and we've widened our remit to encompass safer ageing. And it's our mission to ensure that every person is able to grow old in safety, that they are valued, respected, and live without fear of harm, exploitation, and neglect. So our definition of abuse of older people is a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. So our work covers abuse perpetrated by professionals, paid carers, medical staff, care home staff. But more often than not, the abuse that older people experience is perpetrated by someone related to them. So abuse is being perpetrated against our grandparents, our parents. So what I want to do today is we're going to look at the definition of domestic abuse as it refers to older people. We're then going to look at some of the indicators that we should be looking out for, the risk factors specific to older people, and barriers to reporting. Before that, a statistic: 1 million older people are subject to some form of abuse every year. We use 1 million as an estimate, but it could be 500,000 according to some research. It could be 2.5 million according to other research. And the problem is actually it's very difficult to know the true figure. There is not enough research in this area. So we're still using research, some of it from 10 years old, some of it from overseas. But one thing we do know is that abuse is highly underreported, as it is across demographics, and that there are people experiencing abuse who are suffering in silence. So we're going to talk today about domestic abuse in its widest form with older people. We did a polling at the beginning of the year, and we asked people whether they believed that acts of domestic violence directed towards an older person counted as abuse. And 1 in 3 UK residents thought it didn't. They didn't believe that domestic violence was abuse when it happened against an older person, which for us was a staggering figure. And after 30 years, we know the attitudes about abuse against older people, but still to us that was really shocking. So when we look at older people and abuse, there's some things that we need to remember. What can happen to a younger person experiencing abuse can also happen to an older person. They're subject to the same behaviours: physical, sexual, psychological, financial abuse, as well as coercive and controlling behaviour and neglect. For older people, it is more likely that they will experience domestic abuse from family members and family members they reside with, as opposed to intimate partner violence. But we also know that some older people have been living with abusive partners for decades, or can experience abuse in an intimate partner relationship in later life, in second marriages, for example. We also know that a significantly high number of older men experience domestic abuse as opposed to their younger counterparts. So domestic abuse, what we mean, physical abuse, is pinching, punching, kicking, cutting, burning, and inappropriate administration of medicines. Sexual abuse is rape, sexual assault, inappropriate touching, forced sexual behaviour, including forcing someone to participate in or watch pornography. Psychological abuse is coercive control, which is, I'll do some more on the next slide, but it's humiliation, threatening someone, bullying someone, isolating them from friends and family, blackmailing them. Financial abuse, stealing money and possessions, quite simply, people taking things because it's my inheritance anyway, racking up debt in the older person's name, withholding benefits, taking benefits, and misuse of powers of attorney. And then with neglect, that's depriving people of some of their basic human rights, depriving someone of food, heating, clothing, adequate care and social interaction. Coercive control, as we all know, coercive control entered the statute going into the Serious Crime Act. And within that, it explicitly says that it includes family members as perpetrators. So with older people, it could be denying access to external support, whether that's care services and social services, medical intervention. Controlling access to communication. We know how important communication has been over the last 6 months and how much comfort all generations have gained from being able to communicate with their loved ones in other households. So controlling someone's access to that, controlling someone's ability to communicate with others is something we've seen. We had a couple ring email our helpline, and they couldn't, they couldn't ring the helpline because their daughter, their adult daughter who lived with them, was monitoring their phone calls. So he managed to email via his phone, via his mobile phone when she was in the other room, but they couldn't make any phone calls to anybody because she was listening. Blaming the victim. So this we hear often of someone saying of ensuring that someone doesn't talk about their abuse because they've blamed that older person for the reason that the abuse is taking place. We hear about people saying, it's your fault, I've had to give up everything to look after you. This happens because I've lost my friends and family because I've got to look after you. And also people blaming carer stress. We heard just now about, and you'll all know the difference between anger management and power and control. And abuse is about power and control. Carer stress, which does exist, it's very hard for people, particularly who aren't trained, to take on caring responsibilities, but there's never an excuse for violence against an older person and abuse in any form. But carer stress is used as I'm just stressed, that's why it happened. But that's your fault, because I have to look after you. Threatening to and denying access to grandchildren. A lot of older people have told us that they will put up with abuse because seeing their grandchildren is far more important to them than what they're experiencing. And the threat, as ever, is something that can control that person, even if it doesn't actually happen. Questioning mental or physical capacity. And I'll look at that a bit later. And there we go. So, and those are just some examples of coercive control. So indicators of abuse. I just want to go through some of the sort of key signs that we should be looking out for. And obviously at the moment it's quite difficult when we can't see older people face to face, but these are some of the things that when we are back in contact with our clients, our service users, that we should be looking out for. I just want to add a caveat that some of these can be caused by other reasons. Some physical injuries will happen because of physical frailty, but we should be ensuring that we think about the fact that this could be abuse, as opposed to presuming that it isn't, because too often older people are ignored, people don't ask the questions, and if somebody turns up with a broken arm and says I fell, we think about older people slipping, tripping, falling, when actually what we should be thinking is that what's happened, or has that been done to them. So some of the indicators of domestic abuse. When we're looking at an older person and working with a person, what we need to think about is if they are they as they were before? Has there been any change in behaviour? Are they displaying any form of anxiety or depression or low mood? Physical health. This could be reduced mobility, signs of malnourishment, for example, any bruises or any hidden, I mean, it's very hard to see hidden injuries, but if we're looking at people covering up when maybe they wouldn't be normally, so an example of that would be in summer months if someone's wearing jumpers and trying to hide what's been happening. Appearance, so it's not just whether they're looking sort of how they're physically looking as far as their features, but also if they're dressing differently. Are they dressing how they used to? Has there been a deterioration in their appearance? Has there been a deterioration in their personal hygiene, for example? Behaviour. Has someone become withdrawn? Has they become secretive? Defensive? So if you've had a good relationship with someone before and you notice that reluctance now to speak about anything, that could be an indicator that something's changed at home. Finances. So is someone displaying the signs of not having money when you know that they would before? Is there lack of food in the house? Are they not putting on the heating because they haven't got enough money? When you know that working before with them that they should be able to provide for themselves. The environment, we know that sometimes people will start neglecting their space around them, and also we've had people go in, partners organisations who've said to us that they went in to fix grab rails or whatever and have seen dents in walls, kick marks, scuff marks, that kind of thing. That could be an example of an indicator of something that's happening. And relationships. So how does someone interact with the other members of the household? Does as we would discover the perpetrator, are they allowing that older person to speak for themselves? Are they allowing you to see them by yourself, or are they always there? Has that relationship dynamic changed, or is it something that you think may appear out of different to as you would have expected it to? I think we all have our own ability to, our own sort of spidey sense to think there's something not right here, and what we need to do is act on that and put your jigsaw piece in to build that bigger picture. So there are specific risk factors for older people. When we're looking at family and we're looking at home, there's a reluctance to discuss family matters, and that can make someone more vulnerable to abuse, that people know of that about the person they're abusing, and know that they're not going to speak up. Social isolation and loneliness. If people aren't interacting with others, that's a risk factor, and perpetrators taking advantage of that. Often the person experiencing abuse is dependent on the abuser to manage their care or their finances. And there are obviously risk factors associated with disability and lack of or fluctuating capacity. And the people are also at risk when there's been a recent loss or bereavement. And we know of cases where people have gone in and befriended and then later married people who are grieving and then abuse them in many different ways. And I just want to say briefly about COVID, because obviously the last 6 months have changed the way we work and have changed the way we live. And obviously with self-isolation and shielding, that can have a huge that can be a huge risk factor because people are not being seen. We also know that there's a pressure cooker environment. We know that over festive periods there's an increase in abuse against in domestic situations, and and suddenly you have families thrown together for prolonged periods of time where they're not allowed out, they're not working, there's money strains, all sorts of reasons that can build up to abusive situations. And with that, there's the reduced or no contact with others and with external agencies. So the impact of abuse on older people. Serious physical injuries. I mean, that may be obvious, but we have to think about what that means to older people. So physical injuries could be broken bones, could be bruising, could be cuts. But generally, if you were looking at someone in their early 30s being shoved and falling over, they may generally will be getting up. But when you're looking at someone who's 80 or 90 being shoved and falling over because of the frailty as we get older, it is unlikely people will get back up, and they'll be having broken hips. We hear that when people falling out of bed. Well, if they're being shoved to the ground, that's very likely to happen. So the impact can be greater than on younger people. Then the loss of trust. The person that you love, your family member, has abused you in whatever way, whether that's financially, whether that's by terrorizing you and scaring you. And so that can then transpose itself on other relationships where people feel that they just are not able to trust anyone. Those feelings of vulnerability coming in as well, that we find that older people feel that they weren't able to protect themselves because they feel that they've got frailers, they've got older, they're not as strong, and that can bring up huge issues with feeling vulnerable. And then added on to that is the increased isolation of people of older people keeping themselves and not wanting to put themselves at risk of further abuse. And there's shame and embarrassment, and we heard that before. If your family member, if your adult daughter or your grandson is the person that's abusing you, the shame and embarrassment of being subjected to those forms of abuses, it can be really too much for people in older age, and that reduction of self-esteem and all of that leading to anxiety and long-term depression. And then the loss of money or treasured possessions, obviously that has a huge impact. But if you're thinking about someone, we know someone who had their medal stolen, they just cannot be replaced, that they'd had for 50 years. And then the inability to meet needs, to be put into debt in later life, when you are no longer able to work, when you only have maybe a state pension that you can't earn to replace, and then you become reliant on state benefits and support. And that often can lead to people being admitted into care earlier than maybe they would have if they hadn't experienced any form of abuse. And finally, premature death. We know that the combination of serious physical injuries, mental health, deterioration mental health, all these factors can lead to premature death. So what's important for us as organisations and practitioners is to think about the barriers to reporting. Again, I'm sure this will cover across all of the speakers' work today. For older people, shame, embarrassment, we've just seen that's an impact, but also it's a barrier, that particularly for generational reasons, that people can think that they just don't want to talk about. Older men particularly find it very shameful to talk about the fact that maybe their son or daughter has been able to abuse them. More about families, so fear of losing those relationships with other family members. And it's not just grandchildren, but it's actually the abuser themselves. If that's your son or your daughter, you don't stop loving them, even when they're abusing you. So the fear of that relationship being broken apart by telling someone is an obvious barrier. And even when people want to tell because they want the abuse to stop, they are unwilling to criminalise family members. They don't want their granddaughter going to prison. They don't want their son going to prison. They just want to live without abuse. Fear of being outed for the LGBT plus community, particularly if you're looking at older men who've lived through periods of time where homosexuality was criminalised, that fear of somebody telling people that they're gay it is something that can be a barrier. So those kind of personal things about someone that can be used as a weapon, I guess. And actually they prefer to live with the abuser than alone. So many older people are so fearful of not having human contact as they grow older, and connection with people is important, even if it's bad connection. And then the concerns that nothing will be done. Often people don't want to ring the police. They don't want to bother the police. It's not worth the time. Social services are overloaded as it is. And that generational attitude of it's just a domestic. There's a former deputy district attorney of San Diego, actually, Paul Greenwood. He's actually British, but he only prosecuted abuse cases of older people. And he said at a conference that he feels that our attitudes to the abuse of older people is 30 years behind domestic abuse. So where we had 30 years ago people saying it's just a domestic, we're having that still with abuse of older people, because we don't want to think it's happening to our grandparents, to our parents, and older people, because we don't talk about it enough, don't think that anyone's going to do anything about it. Lack of or fluctuating capacity can obviously is a huge barrier. We know that if someone has developed dementia or Alzheimer's, then they are very unlikely to be able to tell people as they progress into those diseases about the abuse that's happening to them. There's that worry about being believed. If you've been controlled by someone for years who said no one's going to believe you anyway, they'll think you fell. Nobody's going to think that I would do that to you. I'm your son, I'm your daughter. That can be a barrier. And then feeling responsible for the abuse. So the flip of someone saying it's your fault is that an older person believes that they're the burden, that they have to have things done for them. Concerns about unwanted intervention as well. We know that people are very private, and actually what they don't want is social services coming in or third sector. We've heard do-gooders coming in to change their lives and to take over. So they don't report. And even if people want to report, there's a lack of knowledge about where and how. And often that's because services aren't targeted appropriately. Often domestic abuse services are targeted at younger women primarily, and often we see that even the imagery in posters isn't of older people. It's and certainly not of older men. It's very unlikely. So people who need support don't know where to go. And even if they've accessed support, then there's a lack of refuge provision. And they know that, and they've been told that previously. Where do you take someone? Well, maybe we'll go into sheltered housing or care, and people don't want to do that. Or there's been negative response from agencies, and that crosses generations. And then there's the fear of reprisals, which will happen again across all sorts of relationships. But if you do finally manage to tell and to report, and what if nothing's done? You go back and you're living with the person that's caring for you. You go back and you're living with your abuser. And finally, just to say again, and we all know that COVID has increased the barriers for everybody to report, and also for us to be able to see people face to face. So the signs and indicators that we mentioned before are not being observed. And we really do have to think about how we're working with all people, but particularly to older people that we may not be able to go in and see because of shielding. How do we get to them, and how do we let them know that there are people to support them? It's an ever-changing landscape at the moment, and so now more than ever, it's important that we work together. So I just wanted to talk finally a bit about that. Many of you will be used to partnering with organisations such as those that are speaking to today. we're committed to working in partnerships across sectors, across the UK, to help drive systemic and societal change. And this approach works because whilst we have the insights on elder abuse and safer ageing, you will have the insights, experience and knowledge in your respective areas. So there are opportunities for us to collaborate, to drive change and ensure that we support older people to the best of our combined abilities. And we're seeing the benefits of this. We have developed a partnership with a financial institution, and we're developing a national awareness campaign, as well as upskilling their customer service facing teams to recognise the signs of abuse and making that direct change and have impact on the lives of older people. So by working together, whether that's by utilising our existing networks or communication channels, we can maximise the reach of the services we offer, and we're all better able to amplify the voice of older people or those who we work with. But for us, that's the voice of older people experiencing abuse, so that we can achieve a society where our loved ones, our grandparents, our great aunts, our parents, and those most vulnerable can age safely and never experience abuse. Unfortunately, we still have work to do. Please do get in touch with us if you want more information. We have information on our website, but also we have our helpline, which is for anybody experiencing abuse who consider themselves older, and also for anybody concerned about an older person. So whether that's your family or friends, or if as a professional you want to talk confidentially to us because you've observed something, then we're there to do that. I've rattled through that, Valerie, because I didn't have a oh, actually we're all right for time. So yes, there we go. Thank you very much for listening.
Rachel, thank you so much. That was really informative. I've learned an awful lot, and I will certainly be looking to put stuff on our website at work and kind of promote your organisation. I found that really, really helpful. So thank you. Your job is not going to end because all of us are slowly ageing. So we're your next customers, I think, potentially.
Yep.
Okay, I'm sure you have got questions for Rachel, and just please pop them in the QA box. Just a reminder, we're now going into the comfort break. Again, the clip will be played during that break. It's for you to choose whether you are wanting to watch it. I will also say I've noticed one of the questions, and I failed to tell you in the beginning, for which I apologise. All the slides at the end of the conference, we will be circulating all the slides to the attendees. I think I'm going to finish there, and we can start our break, but I need you all back in the room for 11:15, because then we've got Naomi Dixon from the Jewish Women's Aid. So please return then. Thank you.
I am 23 years old and I was born in Egypt. I came to the UK to study when I was 16. I met my partner when I was finishing my undergraduate studies. My parents found out that I was gay and they cut me off, and I had a lot of unpleasant messages and conversation phone calls that they want me dead and they didn't want me to see me again. And I was going out with my ex at the time, and he said, let's get married so I can protect you and you won't have to have visa problems and you don't have to go back home. A week after we got married, he started becoming very violent. First time it started, he came home drunk and he decided that he wants to have an argument, and I ended up being beaten up. And then he said, if you're not happy, you can go back to your family and they're going to kill you. At the time, he knew I couldn't go back. The next day he came and apologized, and he said that he was drunk and he didn't mean what he said. And unwillingly, I believed that. I didn't have friends because he made sure I had no friends, and any friends that I had before I met him, he made sure that they were not good by his standards. And to avoid the anger or unnecessary arguments, I started slowly cutting all of them. And he used to wait outside my uni and workplace, so I can't go anywhere. He used to come to work and phone me. He says, I'm outside, show me that you're inside the building. So I had no chances of going out with friends. And every time I used to go out with drinks with friends at uni, he used to get so angry and screaming on the phone. I used to be very scared. So after I said, it's just best not to do something that would upset him. I didn't realize it was abuse for the entire relationship. He's always blamed it on alcohol, stress at work, his medication. I've always believed all those excuses to the extent where he believes that whatever he will do, he will get away with. I tried from my side to do as much as I can to keep him calm by just accepting or nodding or going along, and try to not be confrontational with him so he doesn't get agitated. I think that the main thing that he wanted to feel that he's in control, so anything that I've done that would have challenged his control would have made him extremely angry. So what I've tried to do is that I tried to never to challenge his control or his superiority in managing my life. And you know, things like what clothes to wear, what haircuts, what to eat. I used to go out like, you buy this, you buy this, you wear this, you wear this, this is how you should look like. And I gave up on a lot of my personality just to keep him calm. I was on a marriage visa, and first thing we used to come to every argument is that if I go back home, I don't know what will happen to me. At least when with him, I knew the risks of what's happening, and I tried to minimize it by keeping him happy, but the risk of going back home was far much greater, and I didn't know what would happen to me. He used to say that he loved me, and I used to believe that, and part of me thought maybe he does love me at some point, and at some level it's just I can't get the good side out of him out. I phoned the domestic national helpline and they said I should get a non-molestation order, and I went with a solicitor and I got that. And once he was served the order, he got so mad and upset, and he kept phoning me hysterically with a lot of messages threatening that he will get me kicked off my studies, he will get me sent back to Egypt. And he said that he's got pictures of me naked, he'll post them on the internet. And he started coming to uni and waiting for me outside for hours. And one day he came into the building and waited till everyone left, came to my desk and beat me up there. Luckily, it was recorded on CCTV camera. For my professional place to be involved, I really wanted to put this to an end and forget about it. I changed my number, I've changed where I live more than 8 times. I've changed where I stay at uni. I've deactivated my Facebook. I've done so many things on my side for him not to see me. I've changed my bike as well, so he doesn't know if I was outside or not. To this very day, I don't know if he's trying to find me or not, but I'm doing my best to be far away from him. I find it very difficult to be friends with people or even have a relationship, and you become very apprehensive because you lose trust and faith in people and you don't know what they might do to you. I have a domestic violence advisor, and he was very helpful because I used to get very down and cry. I used to phone him up, and he used to rationalize things for me and understand patterns of why this is happening. And he kept emphasizing and reiterating that the end of this relationship is the start of a second chance in life, and you have to get this relationship out of the way to have a new start. And sometimes it's very good to have someone to tell you that the whole world is not like that and people are not like that, and you trust you can speak to, and they give you advice. I'm trying to build my personality because I find it extremely hard, when I go to the supermarket now, what to buy to eat, because I was always very much used to that he'll go and buy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I just pay for that and go and buy clothes. It becomes very stressful. I've got used to someone tell me this is what you wear, and whatever comes to my mind of what to wear and what to eat and how to look, now I don't know, and it becomes very stressful. These simple choices that someone assumed and took out of your life. When I'm starting now, it becomes very hard. I've realized that I'm a very strong person to keep up with my ex for that amount of time, and that strength did help me to walk away and to move on with my life. And despite there are days where I feel very low and I feel very angry at myself and feel that I brought this into myself, but I always try to pick up and keep going. And the only thing I'm very certain of is that I'll never let my ex win by destroying my life, and the best revenge I can give back to him is that I move on with my life and become a successful human being.
Okay, welcome back everybody. I'm hoping that you've enjoyed your comfort break and were able to listen to Amon's story. Do apologise, we had a little break in the final stages of that clip, but I hope it didn't spoil your engagement with that particular clip. So what I'd like to do is move forward, but before I do that, we've had a question about social media and a hashtag. So if you are someone that wants to put stuff on social media about the conference, can we ask you to use the hashtag the impact on minority groups? Thank you. So we're now moving on to the sort of second part of our conference. I'd like to welcome Naomi Dixon from the Jewish Women's Aid. She'll be talking about domestic abuse in the Jewish community, what it looks like and why we need a specialist agency. Just some brief information about Naomi. She became Chief Executive of Jewish Women's Aid in 2014 and has led the organisation through a period of growth and change. In 2019, JWA launched a sexual violence support service as well as its pioneering sexual harassment prevention project. These services complement JWA's holistic domestic abuse service, along with its schools and adults education programs. Naomi has been involved in JWA for 18 years, initially as a volunteer. In her previous role as communications and training coordinator, she created JWA's training program to raise awareness within the Jewish community and empower communal professionals to better identify and support women and children in their organisations who are affected by domestic abuse. Naomi is also a trustee of Women's Aid Federation England. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you very much. That was quite an introduction, and also coming on the back of that incredibly powerful and moving case study, which was just, I think, reminded us of the depth and the power that domestic abuse can hold over all of us, and of the women that we work with. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why we need a Jewish domestic abuse service, the impact of COVID, and how we work, and also as professionals how you can refer to our services. So let me just start off with a story, which I think will help people to understand the nature of what we refer to as spiritual abuse. Imagine that you imagine somebody's home. She's set the table for dinner. The guests are starting to arrive. It's the Friday night, so it's the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. The candles are lit. The special bread and the wine are on the table, and the guests all start gathering along with the children of the family to celebrate the Sabbath and also to have a lovely dinner together. And at the beginning of the dinner, traditionally, a couple of songs are sung to welcome the Sabbath, to set the scene, to talk about peace and harmony in the home. The first song is sung and everything is fine. And then before the second song is sung, it's called Eshet Chayil, which means a woman of worth, and it refers to the incoming Sabbath queen, but it also talks about the attributes of the woman of the home. The husband turns to the wife and says, well, you're not worthy. We're not going to sing this one. And she's absolutely mortified because the 20 years of domestic abuse that she has experienced at his hand, that she thought she'd kept quiet, is now incredibly public. And in addition to the escalation and the ongoing patterns of abuse and the cycle and everything that she's kept hidden at home, whether it's financial or physical or sexual, this has now been made public in front of her family and her children and her guests. And just that phrase, you're not worthy of me singing that song to you, exemplifies and totally clarifies for her all those moments of abuse. And that's the point that she realises that she needs to phone up Jewish Women's Aid and seek support. And I think for us, that's also how we understand the need for a specialist service, because when she called us, we were able to say to her, we understand the humiliation and shame that you felt in that moment when your husband publicly shamed you in your own home and said that you weren't worthy of me singing that song to you. We understand how it must have felt when your children and your guests heard him saying that to us. And so that really sets the scene for what we term spiritual abuse, and we talk about that as the misuse of power and control within the spiritual and community and cultural realm of the Jewish community. And so I'm gonna share my presentation with you, but I wanted to set the scene by telling you that to start with. Hold on a moment. Okay, can you see my slides? So I think that story sadly sets the scene for why we need a Jewish Women's Aid. That woman thought she'd hidden everything till then. She had experienced spiritual abuse. We provided her with a soft landing, and that is a part of a picture of much bigger and awful abuse that you as practitioners would recognise in your day-to-day workings. But it's also why we need specialist services in the community, which is why generic services are absolutely amazing, but so are specialist services, and women who reach out to specialist services up and down the country will always say that that actually that soft landing and the understanding that a specialist service like Jewish Women's Aid provides for them is absolutely critical, incredibly important to them in terms of their recovery, because they need to explain less. And when a woman is at an incredibly low point in her life where she's battered and bruised and her sense of self and self-worth has been eradicated and taken away over a series of years, that soft landing and that sense of understanding is absolutely critical to them. We've been around for about 30 years. Over that time, we've supported thousands of Jewish women across the UK. As Valerie said, I'm a trustee of Women's Aid, but we're also members of Women's Aid and of IMCAN, which is a specialist domestic abuse umbrella organisation. And both of those give us an opportunity to benchmark, to work with integrity and make sure that we're actually working to national standards and that we've got a network of colleagues across the sector. The Jewish community, needless to say, is not exempt from domestic abuse. I'll talk about that in a moment about the fact that when you do have a small faith community, I think there's this hope and aspiration almost to think that maybe we might be exempt from having issues such as domestic abuse. There's absolutely, obviously, no evidence to support that at all. But what that does mean is that faith institutions are particularly grateful for having a specialist agency which they can refer to and which understands the specialist knowledge that we might need in order to support the women who we work with. We work as a feminist intersectional organisation. We work on the understanding that domestic abuse affects women more than it affects men. There's an imbalance of power and control in society, which is reflected in abusive relationships. We're here to support the women affected by domestic abuse, and also we work with an intersectional theory, which means that we understand that people and the women that we work with are often disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression, which means that their race and their class and their gender identity and sometimes their sexual orientation and their religion conspire to give them multiple disadvantages. And what that means is that we have to understand that those different ways of being oppressed can clarify in a very, very awful way when a woman is affected by domestic abuse. We also, though, and I think this is one big takeaway that I think is very important, understand that culture, community and religion can be a source of abuse, as we've already discussed, but they also can be a source of comfort for the women who we support. And those women come to us and say, well, actually, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't want to lose everything to do with my culture. They may be practicing Jews, they may not be practicing Jews, they may identify strongly as Jewish, they may not have a Jewish partner, but actually there's part of their identity or practice or culture that they want to keep. And actually, as an organisation within the community, we don't require any particular level of practice, of faith, of anything that they demonstrate. They may eat a smoked salmon bagel once a year. They might not even do that. They might be committed, devout religious Jews. They may or may not have their children in faith schools. but actually what we do is we empower them and support them to make sure that they're able to keep within their framework whichever part of their community and culture that they want to. And that sometimes includes family, because what we know about domestic abuse also, of course, is that the social isolation often means that by the time a woman has sought a support service, their network of friends and family has fallen away, and they're at a point where they've almost got no other options. So when they pick up that phone to us, we know that actually what we want to do is help them to pick up the fractured pieces of their lives, whether they're from our culture and community or elsewhere, and to pick up the pieces and to rebuild them so that they can live an empowered life full of freedom, free from fear, and in the way that they want to. So I'm also just aware that, you know, in terms of the intersectional picture, a lot of the women that we talk about, who come to us, talk about the kind of general external atmosphere, particularly a few years ago, of anti-Semitism, and how they felt about that, and actually how that was also sometimes used as a tool of abuse by their perpetrators when trying to control and abuse them, particularly in terms of verbal taunts and ongoing verbal aggression. And that was something that they really did feel that they could come and talk to us about when they were able to pick up the phone to us. So let me just give you a little bit of kind of context. The Jewish community in the UK has been here for many years, and is largely and in a big part made up of second, third, fourth generation immigrants. There's about 250,000 Jews in the UK, about 200,000 of whom live in London and the surrounding areas. And I'll come on to the Hertfordshire and Welwyn and Hatfield piece in a moment. But I just think it's quite important to understand the context and the size of the community. We support around about 700 women a year, and we support them across the breadth of all of our services. So we're structured similarly to other domestic abuse agencies, with helpline, IDVA and frontline advocacy services, and counselling, and access to emergency accommodation where needed. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how that's changed over COVID as well. But I also just wanted to point out that in addition to all of that, our other strand of work, if you like, is in prevention and education. So we go into Jewish and mainstream secondary schools and talk to pupils about consent education, about the ability to say no, about personal boundaries. And that's obviously become incredibly important post the Me Too movement, where, you know, this is a conversation that teenagers need to be having, and particularly due to extra cyber abuse and the easy access to porn, teenagers really need to understand how porn culture and easy access to sexting and misuse of images online can really contribute to abusive relationships, which we help them to work their way through and be supported through. And we also have a training programme, and I wanted to talk to you about the training programme because we've used it in quite a big way to leverage the support of the Jewish community. So, you know, initially, before we set up the training programme about 6 or 7 years ago, we were able to talk to community leaders who said, well, you know, we're not certain that domestic abuse happens in such big numbers in the community. And also, you know, how do you really help? Aren't you just promoting divorce in the community? You have to kind of and take all this in the context of a kind of very close-knit, family-oriented community, where family values are at an absolute premium, and they're kind of the values, as I said, set the scene at the beginning, where people live their lives by. And we had women coming to us saying, well, you know, I did go to talk to the rabbi, but actually he or she wasn't particularly helpful. They didn't really understand. I couldn't really express to them how I felt. What we all know as practitioners in this area, that actually women tend not to pick up the phone and say, hello, I'm being affected by, I'm experiencing domestic abuse. How can you help me? They'll tend to say something like, well, my marriage isn't going particularly well. And actually it's really important for us as professionals to be able to unpick that. And what women were telling us was that community leaders weren't able to unpick that particularly well. So what did that mean? That meant that we then put together a community training programme. We've reached out to hundreds and probably thousands actually of community leaders over the last few years and talked to them about what domestic abuse looks like. What are the signs of domestic abuse? Think back over the women that you've supported who've come to you saying that they had marital problems. Do you think they were affected by domestic abuse? These are the signs. This is what's happening at home. This is what she might be saying. And actually, slowly over the last few years, what we found is that actually community leaders have started coming to us and saying, well, I've got somebody in my office. She's telling me this. What do I do? And the rate of referral from community leaders and the engagement level has really escalated to a point where I don't think the battle is over, but actually working with faith institutions for us has been an incredibly successful venture. And what that has meant is that women are more likely to be supported by local community leaders if they talk about the fact that they are unhappy in their marriage, for example, as a kind of way of saying that they're experiencing domestic abuse. And we also encourage the faith leaders to speak out as regularly as they possibly can to support our work. And that's not just because we want more PR and publicity, but because actually if you've got a faith leader standing up in a synagogue or in a public space saying domestic abuse is happening to women in this room, to people in this room, to people we know, please seek help if you want, then that endorsement gives women the permission to seek support from specialist agencies. So let me just talk to you a little bit about Boreham Wood, about Hatfield, about Welwyn. So this area, as you can see, this is an article that I've taken from the Jewish Chronicle, which is one of the community newspapers, and it says that Boreham Wood overtakes Stanmore as the UK's biggest Jewish community. Boreham Wood Synagogue has got about 2,500 members aged 21 plus. That's just one synagogue of many in the area that we're talking about today. There's thousands of Jewish people and a growing community in Boreham Wood, Radlett, Bushey, also Hatfield and Welwyn. And last year, significant numbers of women and children were referred to all Jewish Women's Aid services from those areas. And what that means is that we know that there's Jewish women in Hatfield and Boreham Wood and Welwyn who need support, but also I'm absolutely delighted to be here today so that I can reach out to all of you and ask you to refer to us and to see how we can partner together. And as Rachel said, who was speaking before me, you know, you've got the local community knowledge, which is fantastic, and we've got the specialist community knowledge of the Jewish community, and actually together we can form incredibly strong partnerships to make sure that the women who need us have got exactly the right support in place for themselves. So I've talked a lot about the kind of demographics of the community, but I just want to mention also, just like the other previous presenters, about the barriers to reporting, which in some ways are similar to all women in all communities who are picking up the phone to domestic abuse services. I mean, we know that women are incredibly hesitant to pick up the phone and to seek support, and COVID has not helped. But what we also know at Jewish Women's Aid is that the women that we have been supporting have on average been affected by domestic abuse for over 11 years before they pick up the phone and contact us for support. That's 11.5 years of escalating violence and terror and also embarrassment, humiliation, trying to hide all of that. The national average is 9 years though. So that makes me very concerned, and I know that this additional hesitancy to report, which Jewish women experience, is echoed in other small faith communities, where the fear of bringing shame on a family, the fear of not being believed, play out in a really massive way. You know, women in our community are very aware that, you know, their grandma came to their wedding, that, you know, the grandma possibly really loves their husband. Nobody will believe them. They often say to us, well, you know, he's a pillar of the community. He's very well respected. Nobody will believe me. you know, I can always tell them that actually we've got women whose perpetrators come from every single profession in our service, and actually, you know, we will always believe women in a supportive way, and that's what we're here to do. That's what all domestic abuse services are here to do. But you know as well as I do that after 10 to 15 years of being told nobody will believe you, you start to believe it yourself. You start to believe that actually that there is no hope, and even if you reach out to somebody and say my husband's abusing me, and you reach out to a friend or a rabbi or a community leader who knows you, they'll say, but he's such a lovely guy, he's so supportive, he gives a lot of charity in the community. And actually we're here to say, well, that might well be the case, but actually you never know what happens behind closed doors, and you know, there's no particular reason why we wouldn't believe a woman who's telling us that her perpetrator is well known in the community just because that's the case. We also look at and other barriers to reporting include the immigration issues that other agencies face, the language barriers. Some women come to us, they're not from Britain, they might be Israeli, they might not have a visa. That might then impact on the fact that they've got no recourse to public funds, and it's incredibly difficult sometimes to find emergency accommodation for them. And then cutting through all of that, of course, you've got the concerns that women worry that they might lose their children, partly because they have also, that's another tool of control, isn't it, that they're told that they're not going to be able to hang on to their children if they seek support and if they go through the court process. You know, and part of what we do really is just to make sure that actually the women have got the best possible, most holistic support that they can get. And that all of those fears are allayed, and actually we're here to hold their hands and take them through every process that they need to go through step by step. I wanted just to talk a little bit about Jewish divorce as well, because that's an issue that does come up quite a lot. Just to kind of explain the context of it. So the get is the piece of paper that a Jewish man needs to give willingly to his soon-to-be ex-wife, and that ends the Jewish marriage. So he has to give it willingly, she has to accept it willingly, and all of this is set out in Jewish law. And sometimes refusal to give a get can play into abusive behaviours, in that a man can say, well, I'm not going to give you the get because either I don't want to, or I'm not going to give it unless you guarantee to me that you're going to give me access to the children, or you need to stop fighting me in the courts for money. So it can be used as a tool of control, and we would consider that to be part of the arsenal of abusive behaviours that come under kind of religious or spiritual abuse that some of the perpetrators that we know about use. However, what I want to tell you about is that under the Divorce Religious Marriages Act 2002, a person whose spouse is refusing to give or accept a get can apply to the court handling the civil divorce for an order which would prevent the court from making a decree absolute until the get has been given. So what that really means in practice is that if the decree nisi has been given and the perpetrator is refusing to give a get, then the court can say, well, you're not going to get your decree absolute until you've given the get. And that is a provision put into British law in 2002, which actually has been incredibly helpful in our community to help the number of what we refer to as chained women to actually get their decree absolute from the court. It's not a perfect scenario because, you know, you can see here there's two case studies, again, taken from the Jewish press, the clippings, but you can look them up. And we work with a lot of women who are struggling to obtain their religious divorce. So refusing to give it is controlling behaviour, and actually navigating through the Jewish court process is something that some Jewish women find really difficult, because certainly in the Orthodox side of the community, the Beth Din, which is the Jewish court system, is run by men and can be quite an intimidating place for women. So they have recently put into place a GET caseworker, so a woman whose job it is to hold women's hand and make sure that they're supported through the process. And we've massively supported this move because it's obviously been incredibly helpful for women, and it's softened the whole process for them. These two cases that you can see here, though, have massively benefited from the 2015 coercive control legislation, which was used effectively in both of them, because both of them had a man who was long-term refusing to give the woman a GET, a Jewish divorce, and they felt, both of these women, that they had almost exhausted all possibilities in terms of where to go next, and they were almost kind of a stage of giving up. Some women who have a Jewish marriage don't have a civil marriage as well, and so that legislation that I referred to earlier can't be used, because if they don't need a decree absolute or a decree nisi, then actually there's no way of the court to leverage the pressure for the man to give a GET. So actually in these two cases, what we saw recently, there was a threat of a private prosecution on the perpetrators, on the men who were refusing to give the GET. They were threatened with a private prosecution, possibly resulting in prison sentences, and that encouraged them both to give the GET to both of the women, and that ended their Jewish marriages, which was a huge relief to both of them. This woman on the right, Rivka, you can see she had a 9-year wait, which is obviously ridiculously far too long to be tied to a man who you know has been abusive, and who you're waiting for a GET from, and both of them now have the freedom to move on with their lives. And our caseworkers, we make sure that they're familiar with this area of work and are able to liaise directly with the Jewish courts and the community leaders, just to enable better support for women in this kind of scenario. So coming back to the impact of COVID on domestic abuse survivors, we have, like other agencies, have experienced a huge amount of, unfortunately, what we're terming the misuse of well-intentioned lockdown measures. We've seen a lot of women who are telling us that actually being trapped in the house with an abusive man has just made their lives 100 times worse. That we've had women who've told us that their access to housing has been withdrawn because of COVID delays. We've also had women whose child support agreements have been snarled up in delayed court processes, and what that's meant is that they're just tied at the moment to living with perpetrators, sometimes in abusive and escalating situations. Women are telling us that they're experiencing increased anxiety, higher likelihood of physical abuse because of this kind of cauldron effect of not being able to get out. We've had women who've told us that they've lost their jobs because of lockdown, and what that has meant is that they've not been able to move on because of limited financial means. And of course, the impact on children is always absolutely enormous with domestic abuse. I mean, it's traumatic and abusive for children to witness that in the first place, but actually being in a lockdown situation has just meant that we've been working in our therapy service with more and more traumatized children who just kind of can't see their way clear to a space where they've got the freedom to kind of think clearly without being with their parents who are warring, and the mothers being abused, and particularly when school was closed, that was incredibly difficult for those children. We're obviously incredibly worried, of course, that women who are in abusive situations have got less access to services and less access to the phone to pick up or to email to say, hello, help, I'm being abused. And what that means is that actually those situations can tip over into higher risk very, very easily, and that's a huge concern for us. I'm just aware of the time, but I do want to just run through quickly what we've done differently over the last period. And as you can see, this is a lovely flyer for our new web chat service, which, getting back to that whole kind of how difficult it is for women to pick up the phone, we and a lot of agencies up and down the country have set up a web chat service which allows women to contact us via our website on their phone without actually speaking out loud. It has helped some women. We've still had some women picking up the phone saying, look, I've got 5 minutes, I'm in the car, what can you do? What do I need to do next? And that's been incredibly difficult for us to hear, but also just very, very worrying that there's women who still can't reach out to us. So web chat has really, really helped during this period. Of course, all support's done remotely. We have access to emergency accommodation, as have other agencies, but what that has meant has been that some women have, one woman told us that, you know, she contracted COVID herself after 16 years of being in an abusive relationship. She was in a really bad way already in terms of the abuse and what she'd suffered, but then she got long COVID, came home, needed care, and the abuse escalated. So in addition to needing a carer, what she had finished up having was long COVID and a perpetrator with escalating abuse, rather than coming home to a home where somebody was going to look after her. She realised that, you know, it was awful, to the point that she didn't have access to the kitchen. She was made to eat in her bedroom all the time. She had no money. She was miserable. The escalation was ongoing, and she eventually managed to get in touch with us, and we put her in emergency accommodation temporarily, and she then moved to social housing. And she told us that for the first time in nearly 2 decades she'd had a good night's sleep and felt safe, which is just amazing to hear. But obviously those 2 decades with the kind of clincher of long COVID at the end of it is just a heartbreaking story. I noticed that today there was a report from Refuge and Surviving Economic Abuse talking about the economic and financial impact on survivors of COVID, and that's what we've seen a lot of as well. And that's a really good example of somebody who, she had no financial control at the beginning of COVID, but that obviously got escalated towards the end of it when she had even less. And perpetrators seem to be misusing finances and leveraging even more economic control during this period than they normally would do as well. We have had a lot of destitution that we've seen. I fundraised at the beginning of this period so that we could give out welfare grants to women, and we've given out about 50 grants totaling almost £20,000 over the last few months for things like food and utilities and nappies and petrol for cars, and also a lot of technological equipment for children who didn't have access to it otherwise. And all of that is stuff that we provide willingly because we had the money. We wouldn't normally have had the money for that, but it was really important for us to fundraise towards it. But actually 2 years ago, we wouldn't have seen that level of destitution. And I really think that that's changed and escalated. And we are very concerned about how the next few months are going to play out with increasing unemployment as well. So I just wanted to end by telling you about this woman who moved into a studio flat through us. We helped her to move into emergency accommodation. She told us at the end, I don't know where I would be without Jewish Women's Aid. She said, I'm so grateful to them, as I'm now able to live the life I would have been able to for the last 25 years, free from fear. And what I wanted to end with was just to encourage you to refer to us, find out more about what we do. It's all on our website. We would love to come and run training sessions for your agencies so that we can better work together and partner and make sure that every woman that we're working with together has got a holistic and very bespoke set of services which will help them to move on to live a life free from fear. Thank you very much.
Alex, are you good to go?
Yes, I am. Let me just share my screen.
Thank you.
Right, I'm just having to tell Teams that I'm happy to look at the screen, which might take me a minute. Okay, I think this is visible, although I can see that I'm live. I'm not sure if my slides are. Zoe, would you be able to let me know if you're able to see my slides?
Sorry, Alex. It's showing your desktop, so let me just
unshare that and try that again then. Right, is that showing, Zoe?
No, it's not. Do you want me to share it for you, Alex?
If you could do.
Yeah,
I don't know why Teams isn't playing ball.
I know, it's bound to happen. I'll share it for you.
Thank you. Okay, brilliant. That looks like, oh. Okay, great. Thank you so much for doing that, Zoe. I will give you a shout if I want you to switch slides. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be talking to you all today, and it's been really fantastic to hear from the other speakers about working with minority survivors of domestic abuse. My name's Alex White. For the last 3.5 years, I've worked on the national LGBT domestic abuse helpline run by Gallup. And I'm now assistant manager of the team, which has expanded considerably during the pandemic, during the lockdown. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about our national helpline service and the experiences of domestic abuse for LGBT people, some of the barriers that they can experience for getting help, and how we can, as professionals, work with that to sort of reduce those barriers where possible. For anyone who's less familiar with the acronym LGBT+, where you hear me say it or you see it in the slides, that refers to lesbian women, gay men, bisexual people, transgender people, non-binary or genderqueer people, so that's people who don't exclusively identify with the categories of man and woman, and other gender and sexually diverse people such as intersex people. So that's what I'm referring to whenever I use that. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So I can just talk a little bit about who Gallup is. Gallup began in 1982 as a response to the homophobia and police discrimination that was very commonly experienced by LGBT people at the time. And the main focus was on hate crime and discrimination from the police. We now have 3 main focuses as an organisation. Hate crime is still a really major area of work for us, and we support people with any violence or abuse that's caused by attitudes that are hostile to LGBT people. So that can include abuse from neighbours, online abuse and discrimination experienced by services and in private businesses. And the hate crime team runs a helpline and an advocacy service based within London. We also now recognise the harm caused not just by societal prejudice, but by those within our community as well. And like many minority communities, as we've heard today, there can be a desire to not necessarily see or recognise harm that LGBT people do to one another. But we now provide support to LGBT survivors of sexual and relationship violence. So we run a sexual violence service that supports LGBT people who've experienced rape, sexual assault, child sexual exploitation or trafficking. And we speak to a lot of young people through that service who've experienced sexual violence or child sexual exploitation in their relationships. And we also see a lot of young LGBT people who experience abuse from heterosexual relatives. And that service provides a casework service within London. We've moved ahead to another slide. Thank you. Gallup also runs a national domestic abuse helpline and remote casework service and a pan-London casework service for LGBT people who've experienced domestic abuse. And I'll talk a bit more about the helpline and those who contact us later on. Next slide. I think it's very useful to think about who comes to mind when we think about domestic violence. For a lot of people, and that includes people within the LGBT community, and it includes many, many professionals, I think this is something that all of us find, that person is female, they have children, they're straight, the perpetrator's male, they're often white, they're often able-bodied. And that person is going to affect our work and our ideas of who an abuser is and who a victim is. And although that, domestic abuse and violence is something that does disproportionately impact women, that's not the only setting in which domestic abuse exists. Next slide. So you heard earlier the experiences of Amon, who was a gay man who experienced domestic abuse. I think he's someone who'd worked with our organisation quite a long time ago, and that's how we have access to that interview. And I want to use that to really demonstrate that to anyone who's got familiarity with domestic abuse, you're probably going to recognise a lot of the experiences that he talked about. They're not actually a world away from the things that are experienced by women or by heterosexual people or by cisgender people who are not trans, when they experience abuse in a relationship or from a family member. So, we heard that Amon experienced emotional abuse. He was verbally abused and threatened by his partner. He was physically hurt by him. He came and beat him up after his non-molestation order was served. He was stalked and harassed by his partner after the relationship ended. And he had some additional vulnerabilities that made him more vulnerable to the abuse. He couldn't return to his home country because of his identity, and his position as an immigrant in the UK made him more vulnerable in being married to his partner. And his age, his lack of family support, and his lack of understanding to begin with that what he experienced was abuse all contributed to the vulnerability that he experienced. And it's undoubtable through listening to that he's a survivor of domestic abuse. And I know that sometimes for professionals who've not worked with LGBT people before, it can be really reassuring to hear that and just think, yeah, I understand this. This is familiar. This is very classic in terms of abuse and in terms of power and control when I think of, other clients. And that's really a very key first step in providing helpful support to LGBT people, is seeing what they experience as abuse, as serious, as harmful, and not being taken in by myths or narratives about LGBT people and domestic abuse that might suggest otherwise. Next slide, please. So just to tell you a little bit about the National LGBT Domestic Abuse Helpline. Our clients can contact us by phone, email and web chat, and we offer listening, information and signposting or referrals into our own or other services. And that offers a route into our London-only, historically face-to-face, currently remote casework service, and also a national remote casework service, which is offered over phone and email. Along with many other services, we've seen quite a significant increase in demand for what we provide since March 2020. This has been part of an overall trend for us, but it's become significant in the wake of the pandemic. So in Q3 of 2019 to 20, so towards the end of 2019, we had about 1,000 contacts a quarter, and that was quite typical for us then. And then in Q4, January to March, at the beginning of this year, we had about 1,500 contacts in that quarter. And then in Q1 of 2020 to 2021, we had almost 2,000 contacts. So within a 9-month period, we've had double the number of contacts. And we believe that lockdown has really contributed very, very significantly to that. Back in March, I would have told you that many of our clients spend the majority of their contact with us emotionally offloading about what's been happening to them and trying to make sense of it. And we still do focus on that kind of work, on validating that experience as real and serious and not their fault, and locating the control or power of what happens next with them, whatever steps they want to take, whether that's referrals, signposting or something else. But we've noticed a really significant shift in the types of contacts we receive, leaning towards much more formal help seeking and requiring advice and guidance to overcome very specific difficulties rather than calls that focus solely on emotional support. We've noticed a real increase in calls regarding homelessness and contacts from young people aged 30 and under. And we find that we're offering signposting options to the majority of callers, and we discuss civil and legal remedies with about a quarter of our contacts, and we refer directly in services for about 20% of our cases. And that's been quite a change for us. It's been an adjustment to the way we work and to the way that we interact with our contacts. Next slide, please. We're contacted by a very wide variety of people from across and sometimes outside the LGBT community. Sometimes people get to our number in a list and see domestic abuse and just give us a call and don't realise that we're a specialised service, and we still try and offer a little bit of support to them before we signpost them on. And I think Amon's account of his experience really shows how intersecting and life experiences need to be taken into account when we're supporting clients. So people with disabilities, health conditions and mental health conditions are very overrepresented within the LGBT community and within our clients. And this can make them more vulnerable to abuse. We also know that abuse can impact mental health very significantly. A lot of our clients report symptoms and experiences very consistent with experiences of trauma, like depression, anxiety and PTSD. And suicidality is very high. It's something that we heard a little bit in Amon's account, his very low mood, his lack of self-esteem, and the sort of really long-term impact that had on his life and how he experienced himself for quite a long time after the abuse ended. Around 10% of our contacts are trans people. They are more likely to be reporting familial abuse from family members, especially parents, than other kinds of abuse, so abuse from romantic partners, especially if they're younger and still living with their family of origin. And we know that trans people are twice as likely to consider and attempt suicide than non-trans LGB people. And this risk really significantly increases for younger clients. Something like 72% of young trans people have self-harmed at least once. And this is a real vulnerability that we bear in mind when we're hearing from that age group. Compared to the general population, we see a much higher proportion of our contacts coming from Black, Asian, minority ethnicity backgrounds. Many are British born, all with secure visas, but many have more recent or precarious immigration situations that make them more vulnerable to abuse, similar to what Amon described. And then there's potentially a host of other challenges there, such as language barriers, experiences of racism, and challenges with earning money if they're not able to make an income in the UK at the point that they're contacting us. Next slide, please. So it's important to think about, like, why are there barriers to LGBT people accessing services when they experience domestic abuse? There's been a really important historical need to highlight the large number of female victims in relationships with male perpetrators. And so mainstream services do historically put male on female abuse at the forefront of societal narratives about abusive relationships. And there's a very strong understanding of domestic abuse within a heterosexual and gender normative framework. Although that can mean that LGBT people and experiences are often absent from those stories and images. And if they can't see themselves in that picture, that's going to impact their understanding of abuse and how to access help with abuse. So the myth that women can't perpetrate interpersonal violence can mean that LBT, lesbian, bisexual and trans people in relationships with women may not see themselves as victims of abuse. And male victims may find that they're not taken as seriously by the police and other agencies. And similarly, in LGBT services, the focus has been elsewhere historically. So it's been around HIV, sexual health and hate crime, and widening the focus to include supporting people with harm from within the community is less familiar and can be very uncomfortable. Minority communities can feel under pressure to present as acceptable, as safe, as healthy to one another, to those outside the community. And that can create a little bit of community complicity in excusing or ignoring harm in LGBT relationships. And unfortunately, lots of people can come to their relationships with a belief that their LGBT relationships are meant to be unhappy or secretive or pathological. They may have narratives in their mind as LGBT people as being dangerous, predatory or emotionally unstable. And when this fits in with their partner's behaviour towards them, they won't necessarily see that as something that's abnormal or something they need to seek help with. And that might then be reinforced by messages that they receive from friends or family or from services or wider society. So that can create a bit of a gap, which in both the narrative, how we understand abuse as a society, but also within the services that can support people with that. And LGBT people can then fall into that gap. So now I'm going to talk a little bit, if we go to the next slide, about how we can think about removing barriers. Actually, if we go to another slide, because I have nothing to say on this one. There we go. Next one along. Oh no. Keep going forward. There we go. So if we come back to this question of who we imagine when we think of domestic abuse, of who experiences it, these images and ideas can result in people being missed. I actually think we might be one slide too far forward. Brilliant. Yep. Okay. These images and ideas can kind of result in people being missed or parts of them being missed. And we never want to give someone the impression that part of themselves is not accepted or seen or understood, especially when we are supporting them as a victim of harm and abuse. We know that no group or no person is one-dimensional, and no domestic abuse service works in a one-size-fits-all way. We always try to avoid making assumptions, and it's just the same for coming into contact with LGBT clients. We do our best to not make assumptions about clients and to meet them where they are, rather than saying, well, you've got to come to us and our understanding of abuse and what your life looks like. What it means for how we work as professionals, as people coming into contact with abuse survivors, is in some ways not being afraid to ask or check in with people about things you're not sure about. It can really set off an anxiety that we're treating someone differently. But what we're doing is actually paying close attention to someone's needs, and it's very good for people to feel that they're an object of care and attention, and that people want to get what they're doing with them right. How we ask those questions can be very important, because you can ask a question about someone that can make them feel very different, very othered, or it can make them feel very seen and very included. The kind of questions that might come up more if you're trying to be inclusive of LGBT people will be things like, how do you describe your sexual orientation? How do you describe your gender identity? How would you like us to refer to you? What title do you use? What gender is your partner? What pronouns do you use? So, do they use he, she, they or them, things like that. And being grateful when they correct you or share information about themselves in response to that, so that you know that you can kind of proceed confidently having this better understanding of them. And if those questions are asked routinely across all clients, they feel natural and they don't feel like someone's being picked out or profiled. And in addition to this, providing reflection and space to discuss cases within the organisation. I think a lot of us operate with a culture of learning, knowing that we can make mistakes and that we can all learn. The domestic abuse sector is developing and thinking and changing all the time. And it's the same within the LGBT community. Even Gallup, as a community that's staffed by LGBT people for LGBT people, we know that the community shifts and changes, and that we have to keep up with that in order to remain inclusive and welcoming. And having reflection spaces where we can share things that we're anxious about or not sure about, or think we might have gotten wrong in a case, with supportive colleagues who are being non-judgmental, that really gives us that room to discuss those and make sure that we do get it right in future as much as we can. Next slide, please. So knowing the unique experiences and vulnerabilities of a client group is, of course, really, really vital. What are the barriers that prevent them accessing services? And for LGBT people, a lot of that can be their perceptions of services, their perceptions of abuse, and also the experiences that they'll have had with services in the past. So LGBT people might feel that non-LGBT services are not for them and won't serve them effectively. They won't see themselves within the public story of domestic abuse. They may have very serious experiences of discrimination, abuse, and have been taught not to take their own needs seriously as an LGBT person, and that can make seeking help really, really challenging. And they may come to services with a concern that they will experience homophobia, biphobia, transphobia when seeking help. And knowing that those perceptions are held by LGBT people puts services in a very good position to then think, well, how can I address that? How can I make it really clear they're not going to have that experience with us? It's also really worth understanding the differences in how abuse can manifest. I mean, we heard from Amon's account that it probably was very familiar in many ways for anyone who's worked with domestic abuse survivors, but some aspects made it quite unique. For example, his sexuality, meaning he couldn't return to his home country, wasn't just practically and emotionally challenging, but essentially he knew that going back could mean a death sentence for him. Remaining in an abusive relationship actually was a much safer option in many ways. Some other things that it's worth being aware of when looking at LGBT people's experiences of abuse are they being threatened with having their HIV status outed, or their gender identity or sexuality, their gender transition or treatment for HIV may be being disrupted. They might be in a very small community where someone with more power and status has a bit more leverage over them, or limit where they can turn to for support. Or they might be very distant from their community. They might be in a rural area or somewhere with no local services for LGBT people where they can meet other people or come into contact with services. Knowing how the abuse might manifest and what the tools of power and control can be means it can be recognised and taken seriously. And at the end of the day, it's not going to be necessarily about the specifics ways that abuse manifests. It's going to be what's the perpetrator trying to achieve, and it's power and control. We really know that. Another thing to think about in terms of that is going to be risk assessments. We use the DASH at Gallup, but we may ask additional questions that we know can be vulnerabilities for LGBT people. So relationship factors, if that's their first relationship, their first LGBT relationship, they don't have a model for what healthy, safe relationship looks like, that can be an additional vulnerability that we need to be aware of. How out are they to their community and their personal networks? If they don't have a family or support system they can fall back on, then that's going to be more challenging for them. Immigration issues, as we mentioned with Amon, drugs and alcohol. Minority stress can contribute to mental health issues and harmful drug and alcohol use. Parties and hookup spaces can be a really big part of community bonding and meeting other people, but for some it can be putting them at risk or impacting the abusive partner's behaviour. So drugs that are normally associated with chemsex, drugs like crystal meth, that can mean that a perpetrator is experiencing a lot of paranoia and erratic behaviour on top of being abusive, and that can be really dangerous. Next slide. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to just dash through this a little tiny bit, but my slides with all my notes below them is going to be circulated. You as an organisation can signal inclusivity and welcome to this community at every stage someone might pass through to come receive support into your organisation. The advertising that is on your website, your literature on your premises, images and language and how people are referred to can really signal, you know, we're open to all, we support all genders, we're open to LGBT clients. Having a rainbow flag on the website is something I look for if I'm looking to refer someone into a service, because I can say to them, listen, they're trying to signal that they understand LGBT people's needs and experiences. And so, you know, I'd feel more confident referring you here rather than somewhere else, essentially. Having language that refers more to spouse and partner rather than boyfriend and girlfriend, small things like that. It's just little signals, little clues that people can pick up on. Having particular services that are available for LGBT people, if that's a possibility, like having an LGBT worker. And having procedures that sort of account for some of the things that might come up if you're serving an LGBT community. So how you would handle a call from someone whose name doesn't match, I'm putting match in air quotes, the tone or pitch of their voice. What are the processes to manage confidentiality in a very small community? Someone doesn't want to contact you thinking, I might out myself because I know some of the staff here. Is it very clear that that's something, that confidentiality level can be offered to people? And the internal culture of an organisation being representative of LGBT people and their needs in internal documents and policies, not just so that becomes very natural for everyone to then say, you know, we always have this understanding that we carry around with us of LGBT people and where they fit into our work, but also what support and awareness that gives to LGBT people who work in that organisation and what they need. It's just going to create a more positive and supportive space for everyone. Next slide. So I think a really great piece of advice, and we've talked about partnered work all the way through this, is not doing this by yourself. We're very, very open to professionals from all organisations contacting us. If they've got worries about working with a specific client, if they're looking at how best to frame something on their website, anything like that, we'd love to support you on our helpline or pass you through to someone else in the organisation who we think can offer that additional support. We know that sometimes there can be difficult questions that you haven't got anywhere else to go to and you can't ask the client. We're happy to take those. Our website has got a variety of written resources aimed at both clients and professionals around LGBT abuse. And, you know, you yourselves in the local area can make sure that your referral pathways are very sound. So who you refer to for LGBT specific stuff and letting local LGBT organisations know that you're there and ready to receive referrals. And, you know, what we're all doing here today, which is educating ourselves from specialist organisations, from organisations that work with particular communities, that's vital. We offer training to people who want to increase the understanding of LGBT domestic abuse experiences in their organisation. You can email us on the helpline, and we'd be happy to pass your email through to our training colleagues and put you in touch with them. And I think that's probably everything from me. Thank you so much for listening, and hopefully I'll be taking some questions in a little bit.
Alex, thank you very much for that very informative talk. I've certainly learned something, and I think everybody else has learned something. And I really believe that our conferences just help inform the agencies within the county that all this work is going on. So I'm very grateful to all of you for being with us today, and also for all of the attendees. We now pass on to the question and answer session, and I have got a few questions. I'm going to take them in order of speed. And so, Leonie, for you, the question is, it would be great to know if you would recommend mediation for child to parent abuse generally, and if there's an age cut-off for that?
Yeah, so I think that mediation can be an effective tool to use within that situation. I think that it would be up to the professional to decide how far it's escalated, because our mediation team is sometimes necessary to work in partnership with children's services, with the police force, depending on what's going on. So it would really be something that would need to be decided on kind of a case-by-case basis. So I'd recommend getting in touch with the mediation team, because they will be able to make that call on a case-by-case basis, depending on the level of escalation. But certainly there is usually always a place for mediation, even if it's something that happens after a little bit of time has passed, or other intervention services have done some work first, and then mediation can help. So and the second part, Val, was age, I think. So our mediation services, there's two parts. So we've got our under 16s mediation service, which works with anyone from age 11 to 16. So this is just the young person in the family. Obviously they work with the whole family, but if the young person is age 11 to 16, then they work with our under 16s mediation. And then we have our mediation that's for anybody over the age of 16. They work with ages 16 to 24. The young person needs to be within that age bracket.
Lovely. Another couple of questions for you. What is the youngest age you will work with?
So 11 for Hearts Young Homeless, and it also depends on what service you're accessing. If we're talking about just mediation, it's 11, but depending on the service that you need from us, all of our services vary. So I'd really recommend visiting our website, because all of the information regarding ages is on there. But again, if you're stuck at any point, just give us a call and have a chat, because if we're not the right service for that young person or for that family, then we'll signpost, and we're usually like really knowledgeable about knowing which is the right service. So
lovely. And another one, are service users risk assessed?
Yes, for everything. Yeah, so it will be risk assessed within mediation. All that are taking part in mediation will be risk assessed, not just the young person. But crisis intervention, we need risk assessments, and floating support services. Everybody that we work with will need to complete some form of risk assessment, and all of those risk assessments are co-produced with service users, so that they are hopefully comfortable for the service user and relevant. So we're only getting that relevant information that we need to keep everybody safe within that family, and yeah, so everybody is risk assessed.
Okay, thank you, Leonie. I think we need now to move on to Rachel. So the question, Rachel, is the prevalence figure reported incidents or self-report, i.e. extrapolate surveys such as the British Crime Survey data? Did you get that, Rachel?
Yeah, I'm just trying to unmute.
Perfect.
Rachel, you're on mute. We can't hear you. There you go.
That's better.
Oh.
It's because there's a delay. I thought I'd come off and then put it back on. Apologies for that. So as I said earlier, the figure that we use, the 1 million, is an estimate because of the lack of research, and there will need to do some research in this area. The other figures I gave, the lowest figure came from a piece of research that took place in 2007. That gave the 500, and obviously we're a lot further on as far as years go, and we've got an ageing population. The 2.5 million came from the World Health Organization. So it's a combination of pulling things together, the polling we've done as well, but that's why it's an estimate. As far as the the crime survey for England and Wales, up until 2017, they only recorded crimes up to the age of 59. So if you were 60 plus, which is pretty much the age group that we work with, it just wasn't recorded. They've gone up to 74 now since 2017, but obviously that still leaves out a huge proportion of people. So yes, it's based on research, but quite clearly we need something up to date and comprehensive.
Thank you, Rachel. I've now got it's a plea for help really from Laura at Watford Women's Centre. She's in the first stage of setting up a project to support women who are experiencing domestic abuse through a peer-to-peer phone line and support group. One of her initial tasks is to create a clear referral pathway, and she'd really appreciate if anyone has a list of contacts they could share with her, or if you're working for a charity that supports people in and around Watford, please do get in touch. I'll quickly read out her email address. It's laura@watfordwomencentre.org.uk. Hope that covers what you wanted, Laura. And a question for Naomi. Now, I know you've answered it in the chat, but I'm going to read it out anyway. As somebody's working in Dacorum, Hemel, Berkhamsted, Tring, Markyate, would you support anyone in this area? We work closely with St Albans and Watford too. I'd like to share your PowerPoint and info with those areas if you're able to support stroke. So Naomi, you might just want to answer that publicly, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Val. Yes, so I should have said in my presentation that Jewish Women's Aid is a national agency. So, of course, we would support anybody who's working with Jewish women anywhere in the country. So please do just get in touch either via our website, or I've put my email address on the chat. Thank you for the question, though.
That's perfect. Somebody else has asked if it was possible to have references for the case studies so they could read up further.
Yeah, so I'll add them into my slides as well. I'll put a page of case studies on the slide, so I'll need to send them over, but they can be distributed by Zoe after the conference. I think that's what was going to happen.
Okie dokie. Now, I'm not sure, this person hasn't, elder abuse. How do you get other agencies to support? I've had difficulties. Do you support men/LGBTQ+? So I'm not sure whether that's for Hourglass or quite what happened.
If yes, as far as Hourglass, we do support any older person, anybody who identifies as an older person, no matter any other characteristics. So yes, we would support men certainly, and anybody from the LGBTQ+ community, plus any other community across the UK. So how do you get other agencies to support? Not quite sure what you mean by that. At the moment, like I said, with the partnership work, we're trying very hard to ensure we've got referral pathways in place, and that actually that people know we exist. I think Action on Elder Abuse was known somewhat, but since we've rebranded, we're really pushing our voice out there. So anybody who's interested in working with us or finding out more about what we do, we've got details on the website, and I think you'll probably, I don't know if Zoe's sending out our email addresses or the organisation's contact details.
I'm sure she will. I'm sure she will. Anybody else want to chip in on that question? No. Okie dokie. Well, that rounds up our questions. We've had a couple of people saying such great presentations so far. So all good. Well done to all our speakers. I would obviously like to thank them again for their time. I'd like to thank all our attendees for their time. Before all our attendees disappear, I'm obviously thanking you for coming, but on the way will be an evaluation survey, and every year we use this as a tool for us to establish whether we're doing the right thing and what we can put on next year. So I would ask you all, please, once you receive that survey, please do fill it out, spend a few minutes, fill it out and return it. We'd be most grateful. It really is an informative thing for us to use. So finally, thanks to all the speakers, thanks for you as attendees, but most of all, I want to say thank you to the team at Welwyn Hatfield. Without them, this would not have happened. I'm really grateful for all the support and help I've received. And I hope, despite the technical hitches, that you found this conference really informative, and we could probably gear up to do the same, but in March next year, maybe. Thank you once again. I was going to say safe journeys, but probably haven't got far to travel, but just take care and thank you for listening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I am 23 years old and I was born in Egypt. I came to the UK to study when I was 16. I met my partner when I was finishing my undergraduate studies. My parents found out that I was gay and they cut me off, and I had a lot of unpleasant messages and conversation and phone calls that they want me dead and they don't want me to see me again. And I was going out with my ex at the time and he said, let's get married so I can protect you and you won't have to have visa problems and you don't have to go back home. A week after we got married, he started becoming very violent. First time it started, he came home drunk and he decided that he wants to have an argument, and I ended up being beaten up. And then he said, if you're not happy, you can go back to your family and they're going to kill you. At the time he knew I couldn't go back. The next day he came and he apologized and he said that he was drunk and he didn't mean what he said. And unwillingly I believed that. I didn't have friends because he made sure I had no friends, and any friends that I had before I met him, he made sure that they were not good by his standards. And to avoid the anger or unnecessary arguments, I start slowly cutting all of them. And he used to wait outside my uni and workplace, so I can't go anywhere. He used to come to work and phone me and he says, I'm outside, show me that you're inside the building. So I had no chances of going out with friends, and every time I used to go out with drinks with friends at uni, he used to get so angry and screaming on the phone. I used to be very scared, so after a while I said it's just best not to do something that would upset him. I didn't realise it was abuse for the entire relationship. He's always blamed it on alcohol, stress at work, his medication. I've always believed all those excuses to the extent where he believed that whatever he will do, he will get away with. I tried from my side to do as much as I can to keep him calm by just accepting or nodding or going along, and try to not be confrontational with him so he doesn't get agitated. I think that the main thing that he wanted to feel that he's in control, so anything that I've done that would have challenged his control would have made him extremely angry. So what I've tried to do is that I've tried to never to challenge his control or his superiority in managing my life. And you know, things like what clothes to wear, what haircuts, what to eat. I used to go out like, you buy this, you buy this, you wear this, you wear this, this is how you should look like. And I gave up on a lot of my personality just to keep him calm. I was on a marriage visa, and first thing we used to come to every argument is that if I go back home, I don't know what will happen to me. At least when with him, I know the risks of what's happening. And I try to minimize it by keeping him happy, but the risk of going back home was far much greater, and I didn't know what would happen to me. He used to say that he loved me, and I used to believe that, and part of me thought maybe he does love me at some point, and at some level it's just I can't get the good side out of him out. I phoned the domestic national helpline and they said I should get a non-molestation order. And I went with a solicitor and I got that. And once he was served the order, he got so mad and upset, and he kept phoning me hysterically with a lot of messages threatening that he will get me kicked off my studies, he will get me sent back to Egypt. And he said that he's got pictures of me naked, he'll post them on the internet, and he started coming to uni and waiting for me outside for hours. And one day he came into the building and waited till everyone left, came to my desk and beat me up there. Luckily it was recorded on CCTV camera. For my professional place to be involved, I really wanted to put this to an end and forget about it. I changed my number, I've changed where I live more than 8 times. I've changed where I stay at uni. I've deactivated my Facebook. I've done so many things on my side for him not to see me. I've changed my bike as well, so he doesn't know if I was outside or not. To this very day, I don't know if he's trying to find me or not, but I'm doing my best to be far away from him. I find it very difficult to be friends with people or even have a relationship, and you become very apprehensive because you lose trust and faith in people and you don't know what they might do to you. I have a domestic violence advisor, and he was very helpful because I used to get very down and cry. I used to phone him up, and he used to rationalize things for me and understand patterns of why this is happening. And he kept emphasizing and reiterating that the end of this relationship is the start of a second chance in life, and you have to get this relationship out of the way so you have a new start. And sometimes it's very good to have someone to tell you that the whole world is not like that and people are not like that, and you trust you can speak to and they give you advice. I'm trying to build my personality because I find it extremely hard, when I go to the supermarket now, what to buy to eat, because I was always very much used that he'll go and buy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I just pay for that and go and buy clothes. It becomes very stressful. I've got used to someone telling me this is what you wear, and whatever comes to my mind of what to wear and what to eat and how to look, now I don't know, and it becomes very stressful. These simple choices that someone assumed and took out of your life, when I'm starting now, it becomes very hard. I've realized that I'm a very strong person to keep up with my ex for that amount of time, and that strength did help me to walk away and to move on with my life. And despite there are days where I feel very low and I feel very angry at myself and feel that I brought this into myself, but I always try to pick up and keep going. And the only thing I'm very certain of is that I'll never let my ex win by destroying my life. And the best revenge I can give back to him is that I move on with my life and become a successful human being.